Alright guys, welcome to another episode of The Floor is Yours. This time, before we introduce our participants, we'll introduce our judges. We have Ryan and Komal Koli who are here with us judging. Komal Koli has taken part in our debate before, and Ryan is here for the first time. Welcome back, Komal Koli. Welcome, Ryan. To introduce our participants, we have with us Ranak Banerjee, we have Jay Purwar, we have Ishan Banerjee, Anirudh Chaudhary, Shinjoy Sen, Pranit Sinha, Ekalabya, and Ave Tulsian, and I will be moderating. Some of you have returning participants, and some of you are here for the first time. Welcome. The motion today reads, India needs a benevolent leader. Speaking for is Ave, Ranak, Anirudh, Pranit, and Shinjoy. And Ishan. And speaking against are Ekalabya, Jay, and Ishan. So right. So just to repeat, the motion reads, India needs a benevolent dictator. So up first we have Ave. Ave has opted to have 2 and 2 minutes as his time division. Ave, are you ready?
Yep.
Right. So Ave, you have 2 minutes for the first part of your speech. The floor is yours.
So democracy as manifested in the Indian government is extremely inefficient by nature, and as soon as it's governance is very slow, it's inefficient, and it's overall very difficult to control. On the other hand, if we have a dictator ruling a country, then the entire concept of this slow, outdated bureaucracy and inefficiency all goes right out of the window. And again, the reason for this entire inefficiency is the importance of checks and balances in a democratic government, but in a dictatorship none of that is present, and it's a much easier and simpler method of governance. Furthermore, dictatorships in this country would help reduce corruption in the government, especially in the case of a benevolent dictatorship where a dictator is ruling for the benefit of the people and not for the benefit of himself or other members of the government. For India, as everyone knows from the electoral bond scheme, has a very, very corrupt government where any company can give as much money to any political party without declaring it through purchasing electoral bonds. And running a dictatorial government in that way will certainly help reduce corruption. Furthermore, I right here would like to agree that yes, a dictatorship has a lot of downfalls, but a lot of those downfalls go right out of the window as soon as we consider the concept of a benevolent dictatorship, where the dictator is ruling for the people and not for retaining power
30 seconds.
for himself. And I agree, yes, the concept of a benevolent dictatorship is very, very utopian. I don't personally believe a benevolent dictatorship is even really very realistic to take place, especially in India. But the motion here today states India needs a benevolent dictator. So I agree that India needs a benevolent dictator.
That's 2 minutes.
Very, very helpful for us, but I don't think it's possible. Thank you.
Right. So with a pinpoint ending to your speech, thank you, Ave. We'll return back to you for the next part of your speech once we're through. We will take one question per speech and then check with the judges to see if they have a question. We will start with Pranit. Pranit, your question.
Almost the entire basis of your argument lies on the assumption that the current Indian democracy is inefficient and slow. Why is the democracy inefficient and slow? What reasoning do you have to back up this claim?
The reason I believe the Indian democracy is very inefficient and slow is because of the entire bureaucracy which we've been caught up in, and the very fact that there are so many checks and balances on power that when a decision has to be taken, it's reviewed by 15 different people, it's passed from department to department to department, it has to get approved by so many other people. But as soon as a dictatorship comes into play, the dictator makes the decision, it's quick, it's efficient, and it's fast. That's the way a government should work.
Right. Pranit, do you want to follow up, or does that answer your question? All right. I hope the judges have taken that question and the speech. Judges, do you have a question to Ave, or can we move on to the next speech?
Hello, can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Brian, do you have a
Yes.
question?
Yeah. So the question is that in a democratic system, the checks and balances actually ensures that the needs and desires of every person is met. So if you go through a check and balance system, it will ensure that no one is discriminated against and every voice in the government can be heard. So how will you implement such a system in a benevolent dictatorship?
So my the basis of my argument is that as soon as you talk about a benevolent dictator, it is already assumed and it already means that the dictator is going to take decisions which are in the benefit of the people. And I agree, such a system is really not something that's going to happen, but it's what India needs, not what India is going to get.
Right. With
One more
that,
thing,
oh,
one more thing I'd
yeah,
like to add: the concept of a benevolent dictatorship and whether or not it's possible is really not up for debate. It's, I think most of us here can agree that it's not very possible. All that we need to talk about is whether or not this is something that India needs, or whether or not it's something India will benefit from.
right, right. Thank you, Ave. With that, I think we'll move on to the next speech, unless Kamal Kohli, you have a question.
No, I don't have a question. We can move on.
Right. Thank you, Ave. We'll revert back to you again after the rest of the speeches are over. We'll now move on to Ekalabya. Ekalabya, are you ready?
Yeah,
Right. Ekalabya, you've opted for 3 minutes at the start of your speech and 1 minute at the end. We will begin with the first 3 minutes now. The floor is yours.
so the topic of today reads that India needs a benevolent dictator since democracy in India has no proper tooth. So I would like to put forward first the idea of benevolence. The idea of benevolence is very much relative. What I think is good for someone, that person might not think is good for himself or herself. What the government thinks is good for the people might consider it's not good for them. So it's one direction, one dimensional point of view regarding benevolence and welfare should not be supported in a country like India, which is very much diverse and has several like variety and variances in cultures and religions and languages. Secondly, if we go through the history of dictatorial regimes in the world, I think the idea of benevolence is not very prevalent over there. I would like to divide the history of dictatorial regimes into two sections: the fascist and the socialist dictatorships. Well, the fascist dictatorships, which happened mostly before the Second World War, well, I would not like to indulge into discussion very much because we all know it were very detrimental towards the people. They were discriminatory, there was rampant corruption, there was genocide, killing people without any proper cause. That was very much evident. Now, moving to the socialist dictatorial regimes, what many socialist people argue is that those dictatorial regimes at least guarantee subsidized healthcare, subsidized education, welfare for the people, even though it couldn't guarantee the freedom of speech and expression. Well, I must put it forward. If the education of a socialist regime does not portray the corruptions it had committed, the crimes it had portrayed, and covers it up and doesn't portray in its education, should the people not get the opportunity to question the government that why are they not being taught about that? Secondly, in socialist democratic systems, the very idea of socialism, which speaks about economic egalitarianism, was also very much absent. Now, as we see in a country like India, democracy is the most essential political form of government, despite the acts of corruption and the discrepancies. Well, let me put it forward towards you. India is a diverse country. There are multiple facets of opinion present in this country. People have several ideas regarding what's good for the country, what's good for them, what's good for the community. If a dictator comes into power instead of an elected form of government, that would lead to absolute shutdown in the opinion. There would be no freedom of speech present in the governance of the country, and therefore an elected form of government should at least be able to guarantee a form of diversity in its cabinet, in its council of ministers and council of members of the parliament. Well, in a dictatorial form of government, that would be very much absent. And I'd like to end by saying that dictatorship might seem a very much viable option well, as my previous speaker have pointed out, it's not very much possible to have a benevolent dictator, but having a benevolent dictator would seem very much like utopian. Well, I must point it out, it's not about what the country needs or what I want. It's about what's good for the country as a whole, as good for Indians as a whole. And I believe even a benevolent dictator won't be good for the whole country. Thank you.
Right, with a pinpoint ending to your speech, thank you, Ekalabya. Um I hope the judges got the speech, and we will now be taking questions from the floor. We will take a question from Ishan and then revert back to the judges. And Ave, seeing as you have a question, if the judges don't have a question, if they feel the need to listen to it, we will take your question. Ishan, your question.
Right, Eklobo, you talked about how, whenever a dictator comes into power, there is a clampdown of the freedom of expression, there's a clampdown of freedom of speech, etc. But the very motion today dictates the need of a dictator. I don't believe in whether you believe whether that benevolent dictatorship exists or it doesn't exist. What we need to take in the purview of today's debate is that it exists. So taking into consideration the benevolency of that dictator, how would you generalize for a dictator like Robert Mugabe, and on the other hand, a dictator like the founder of Singapore? How do you compare that, as you said? Because what you're generalizing is basically what any dictator does. But you need to understand, today we are not debating about just any dictator. We are debating about a dictator who has
Sir,
a virtue that is
Ishan,
benevolence.
sir,
keep your
can you put
question.
forward your question?
Ishan,
Please.
yeah,
I
right.
just said
Not
that.
about your
How do you draw the
Ekalabya,
comparison between a generalized perspective of a dictator in purview of today's debate, wherein a
okay.
virtue of the
right.
dictator is
Ishan,
already
right. Before you answer the question, Ekalabya, Ishan, and to all the other speakers, please try to keep your questions short, crisp, and to
sorry,
the point.
yeah.
A speech is not required. Ekalabya.
Sir, okay, thank you for the question. Now, as you pointed out, why am I generalizing and how would I compare between the idea of benevolence in a dictator and the generalized perspective as well? Firstly, what a benevolent dictator thinks is good for the country is not necessarily what the people will think is good for themselves. And that's why a democracy is necessary, so that the people can change the government with every coming term so that their interests are represented, not a person who thinks he is the best, he is righteous.
Right. With that, do we have any other questions from the floor? Or do the judges have a question, or should we take Ava's question, Ryan or Kamakoli?
Take Av's question.
Right.
My question was asked by Ishan, but I'll ask a different question. Um, Thank you for your speech. My question was that in a country like India, a lot of people are very disengaged from the political process, and they don't really have much information about what the government is going to do for them and what the government's policies are. They tend to get caught up in the rhetoric and in communal voting. Don't you believe that when people vote in India, they don't really vote for what they were? Don't you believe that having the concept of a benevolent dictatorship would remove all of these issues from the Indian political process and make it so that the someone who actually knows what's good for the people is going to be able to carry out the governance of the people?
Okay, so firstly, thank you for your question. Now, as you said that many people are not very much aware of the political process and the corruptions and are easily influenced by the communal tendencies of the Indian society. Now, let me put it straight to you, sir. Awareness must be created, not the absolute removal of the electoral process. We need to create more awareness in the society. We need to let people know what's it's about, not putting them away from the process. Instead of letting this voting move on, instead of letting this awareness, lack of awareness happen, we need to create further more awareness, not just cancel the voting process so that one person gets to decide what's good and what's not good.
Right. Now, with that,
Could I follow up?
it's on the judges, Ryan
Yeah,
or
let
Kamakoli.
him.
Yeah.
Let him.
Go ahead.
Sir, in order to create such amount of awareness, firstly, it's a huge logistical issue. But even if you managed to do this, So the amount of time it would take to create such awareness is a huge amount of time. Don't you believe that since we're talking about the present, India needs a benevolent dictator now? It may not need one when all of this awareness is created, but don't you think we need one now?
So, first you said it's a huge logistical issue. I believe with 500 million active internet users, it won't be such a great or really difficult task, as we have several social media platforms to inform people. And secondly, uh, as you specified about what's needed now, I would suggest awareness is needed out, not a dictatorship.
Right.
Okay, okay.
I think Abhay, you'll have a speech again later on, the other part of your speech. So I think we'll move on for now. So I think the next speaker we have is Ranak. Judges, we will be now starting with Ranak speech. Ranak, are you ready?
Yeah. So
Uh,
I get to choose if it's 2+2 or 3+1, right?
No. Ranak, the first two speakers have that option because they are the first
Okay.
for and first against speakers. So you will have a total of 4 minutes, only in one part for your speech.
Okay,
And,
okay.
yeah.
No problem.
All right. So with
Right.
that, we'll actually the floor is yours.
So the motion of the House today is that India needs a benevolent dictator. Now, first, what I would like to do is I would like to flesh out my premise. First, the part need and the part benevolent dictator. Starting with benevolent dictator, over here, benevolence is just a person who is minded for the people and who can understand the difference between what he requires and what the state requires. Now, some people have argued that the possibility of benevolent dictator is too less, or that benevolent dictators don't exist, but we have seen throughout history that there have been many benevolent dictators who have come into place and who have done phenomenally in their country. On both sides of the political compass, we have on the left Joseph Tito of Yugoslavia and Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. Both of these dictators took their countries out of very problematic places and they got human and economic development to a very respectable and a global rate. Then the other part is need. Now, I cannot support any dictatorship, any such authoritarian form of government for a long time. What we have to understand is India's situation right now. Is India in a crisis? Yes, obviously India is in a crisis. Let COVID-19 not mask the crisis, as the reports show that we have insane amounts of structural damage in the economy. We have no industrial base for our country. So yes, that is an economic crisis. A dictatorship is not a permanent solution. It's not a permanent form of government, which I'm suggesting. A benevolent dictatorship has to be a temporary solution to bring out India from this crisis. Like during certain times, such as this crisis, the freedoms of these people, as my previous speakers have stated, have to be curved to a certain level so that we can be drawn out of this crisis and then normal democracy can pursue. Now, to give certain examples from political philosophy, I would like to state Plato. Plato once gave a very famous example where he stated, as I am saying, a form of a crisis. Now, in this crisis, it's a very structural crisis. Now, Plato has argued that if everything is put up to the people, and now it's completely the people's choice to choose who will lead them. An experiment was conducted and it was seen that the people didn't choose a doctor who could fix them and who could give them remedies through, let's say, certain painful procedures, but would still help them. They didn't choose him, but they chose basically a clown, a jester. And I think it is not an exaggeration to say that most politicians today are that, clowns. Then I would like to point out another part of why we need a benevolent dictatorship on the other side of political scale. That is the shortcomings of our current political system. That is a democracy. Now, I would like to, it's a two-handed approach on the shortcomings of democracy. The first are populist policies. Now, what are populist policies? Populist policies are basically when the democracy doesn't do something for the betterment of, it doesn't try to sell to the people the development of the country, but it tries to sell to the people their advantages.
1 minute to go.
One very important example I would like to state is that the last Tamil Nadu election, instead of trying to devote funds to infrastructure, what the political parties did is that they promised people free TVs. If they were elected, they would get free TVs. About 40 crores was spent on this scheme. And all of that could have gone towards infrastructure development. And yes, that party did come into power. All of the resources went to waste. And the main reason why I would support a benevolent dictatorship to lead us out of this crisis is that because they can take tough decisions. When the power is not up to the people, but is with one single person who is benevolent, by the way, he can take the tough decisions which are required to bring the country out of this crisis. I would like to cite an example from history where this democracy has failed to take such a tough decision as Congress. Instead of trying to put money into try and create infrastructure and employment schemes for the poor, they have given subsidies to the poor. Multiple, like decades and decades of just subsidized goods have been given to the poor. As there's a common saying, I think you're aware, it's better to teach a man how to fish than just give him a fish. So instead, is that time up?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to just end my speech by saying that having cited all these points, we can see that right now the need of India is a benevolent dictatorship to guide us out of this crisis. In the long term, I do not support the liberty and the freedoms of the people being curbed, but the need of the hour is a benevolent dictatorship. Thank you.
Right. With that, thank you for your speech. We will now move on to questions from the floor. We will take a question from Shinjoy and then revert back to the judges.
Right. Am I audible?
Yes, but can you be a little louder?
I can't hear you, Sanjay.
Right. So in your speech, you said that these benevolent leaders, for these benevolent dictators, the dictatorship will be temporary and only while India is in a crisis, right? But so considering the dictators hold all the power in their hands, how do you propose to remove them from power once this crisis, as you propose, is over?
Exactly. I would have completed that if I had more time. So this is why I have stated a few examples from history. Now, if you look at Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, right? So basically, he guided Singapore out of the oil crisis by selling IT, by selling the mine. So after doing that, he realized that a dictatorship might not be necessary for it, and he reverted to a democracy. That is what I want to show. If the dictator is benevolent, as stated by as the motion states, which is a prerequisite, the dictator himself will be able to judge when it's time for him to step down. And also another very important example of a dictator giving up power is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk of Turkey. After about a few decades of rule in Turkey, he himself willingly gave up power because he understood the needs of the country. That is what a benevolent dictator is.
Right. Right. Now with that, we will revert back to the judges. Ryan, Kamankuli, do you all have a question, or would you like to hear what Pranit has to say? So would you prefer that we move on to the next speech or hear Pranit's question?
Yeah, let Pranit ask this question.
Right, Pranit?
Right. So why do you propose that the alternative to the current economic crisis in India is simply replacing the current concentration of power in a government to a different form of concentration in a power of government, especially considering that you mentioned that freedoms would have to be sacrificed for greater development, especially
Yes, exactly.
considering that economic liberalization is an important aspect of actual economic
So now
development.
if we come to this dictatorship, what we have to understand is India's economic crisis. So India's current economic crisis is caused by a complete lack of an industrial base. Like if you look at the other countries, like let's say the entirety of the West, the US and China, they have gone through proper industrial revolutions. And after that, they have become a service-based economy. But looking at India, we started as an agrarian economy, and now we have absolutely jumped the industrial stage and have become a service-led economy. Like 60% of our GDP is contributed by the service. So the vacuum is in the industrial base which we have. So if there is a benevolent dictator, what dictators can do is they can put state resources towards this industrial base instead of populist policies. What I consider is an absolute waste of state resources.
Right.
And I stated the Tamil Nadu example, I believe.
Yes, you did. Right. Now, I think with that, we'll move on to the next question now. The next speech, which is from Jai. Jai, are you with us?
Yeah.
Right.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Now, I would request all other speakers to mute their mic while Jai gives his speech because there's some audio feedback. Right.
All right, should I begin?
Yes, you may begin. You have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, India needs a lot of things. Better education, better healthcare, more employment, and even IPL at this point. But the one thing it does not need is a dictator, benevolent or otherwise. First of all, the words benevolent dictator sounds like an oxymoron. The entire notion of a man who has consolidated power, has unopposed governance and unchecked rule to be benevolent or kind in any manner seems misfounded. Every dictatorship rises out of the ashes of liberty, of freedom, of free speech. The entire concept of it is based on the fact that the person wants to have utter and complete control over others and wants absolutely all power possible with no opposition whatsoever. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of benevolence right there and there. When a person is self-serving and power-hungry enough to snatch away others' rights and freedom, the nature of dictatorship itself is opposing to benevolence. Today, the proposition will talk about how all dictatorship does not need to be antagonistic, that they will point the flaws and fallacies of the Indian democracy, talk about the corruption and the scandals, how easy every aspect of our country's functioning would become with just one man in power. But, ladies and gentlemen, the sole reason why India does not need a dictatorship is that India is a land with a pantheon of religions, cultures, and languages. Our society is riddled with people of different stratas and sects, each of them demanding to be represented. So, even hypothetically, if a benevolent ruler existed, any decision made would not have the desired public confidence that a democratic government would have. Because a democratic government has accountability that you have been elected by the people, which a dictator doesn't have. So his decisions won't have the same public confidence. Eventually, the people would suspect him of bias. Even if he is not biased, that suspect will persist in the hearts of people. Ladies and gentlemen, benevolence is something very subjective. It's an emotion. It's a person's qualitative characteristic that cannot be measured. So there is no way to identify if a person is benevolent or not. So what if the people suddenly think that okay, he's not benevolent, he's autocratic, he's cruel, and then, ladies and gentlemen, what follows is public criticism, what follows is public unrest, revolts, riots, and it disrupts the country's entire peace, harmony, and domestic turmoil follows. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the subjectiveness of a dictatorship's benevolence. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why our Constituent Assembly had people from every part and sect and religion of our country is to create confidence in the Constitution so that people could rely on it, so that nobody can suspect bias. That is the entire idea behind having a democracy. That is the reason our country needs a democracy so that every person, every group of people has a surety that they are represented. With the factor that there is no bias, and if there is bias, they can do something about it. That is the entire idea. Ladies and gentlemen,
1 minute.
democracy is what is preventing our country from going into complete turmoil and from disintegrating. And lastly, the sole idea of governance, self-governance, the idea that you are responsible for yourself, you have freedom, you have the right to do whatever you want. That is too elusive to be exchanged for benevolent rulership. Ladies and gentlemen, the idea today, the speaker before me talked about how the people do not know what is best for them, but the entire idea that you are in control of yourself and in control of what happens to you is what drives people, and that is what is said that when there is a dictatorship, a revolt will always follow, that people will want to take back power into their own hands. And that is why a dictatorship can never persist, even if the ruler is hypothetically benevolent.
Right. Thank you, Jay. With that, we will now take questions from the floor. We will begin with, I think, Ave, and then we'll revert back to the judges.
Even I have a question.
Oh, right. Anirudh hasn't said anything throughout the debate, so I think we'll start with Anirudh.
Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, you said that uh, our constitution avoids biasness and is equal to all, but don't you think there are separate individual rules for the Muslim? So, isn't that biased?
So when the constitution was formed at that very time, that is what seemed right. That is what seemed appropriate. The point was not that the constitution has certain fallacies. The point is that the idea behind the Constituent Assembly, that's something that people can rely on, something that they can trust.
Right.
Can I say something? Or this is asking you, Suryansh.
If it's a question to me,
Just for the benefit of the proposition.
yeah.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'd also
Okay.
like to say something.
Just Jay, when you say basically what Anirudh talked about, the Muslim personal laws in the constitution, and that is what the general debate in India has been revolving around, the uniform civil code, whether it should be applied or whether it should not.
Yeah.
Now, do you feel that with Muslim personal laws, the Article 19 of our Indian constitution, that is basically the right to equality, is being hampered or is it not?
Right.
Just a question for the house.
I would just like to
A
inform
yes
the
or a
judge.
no, that's all.
Oh, okay. Um,
Or okay, if you want me to include it in my speech or something like that.
yeah, just include it in your speech, because I just like to inform the judges Ryan and Komakoli that this what Ishan said right now is not to be marked, because
Right.
No, but I have a clarification.
a clarification, sure.
Yeah, did the speaker just concede to my question that it was right at that point of time to have different laws for the Muslims? Just a
Right.
clarification.
Hold on. Guys, just a second. Jay, could you just repeat your answer to Anirudh's question in a precipitated manner so we just get an idea of what you actually said?
At no point did the example of the Constituent Assembly was to point out that the Constitution has absolutely no fallacies. The point is that the formation of the Constitution, that is the idea to have people from all over the country elected to write the Constitution, to form it, was to create trust. And that is the concept I'm following for my arguments today. That is to have a democratic government because that gives people trust, accountability. At no point did I ever mention that the Constitution has no fallacies or ever go into the details of the Constitution. It was the formation of the Constitution, that process,
Right.
that idea.
Right. Understood. Ryan, Komakoli, did you get that?
Yeah, Suryansh,
Yes.
can you just like not allow any kind of clarifications
Yeah.
and like random interjections, because this isn't
Sorry,
an
Kohli.
end.
Yeah. All right. Just a request to the speakers: try not to interrupt the flow of
Okay, I
debate.
have a
If you have
doubt.
questions,
I
if you
have a
have a,
doubt on the procedure, Suryansh.
um
Basically, in the previous versions of The Floor is Yours, if you see the recording, there is a general, you've allowed a clarification for a particular side. That is a proper one statement for, clarifying the stance of one side. That's basically the proposition or the opposition on a contradictory speech. So, are we following that or are we not following that?
if all right, two things. Firstly, the procedure for today's debate, as briefed to you, is a slightly different on the request of the judges. That is one.
Okay.
Secondly, any if you would like to ask someone of your own side a question, do it at your own discretion.
Jazz against, I think.
Right. What I am
Yeah.
telling you is you said if one is allowed to ask someone of the same side, I am saying yes. And with that being said, I would request all the speakers not to make any other clarifications in the chat box. There is no reason to interrupt the flow of debate. With that, Ava, is there a question you have? Question to Jay.
Yes.
Wait, before we go to your question, depending on whether Ryan or Common Cooley have a question, will we take your question?
No, let him ask.
Right. Ava?
Sir, you were talking about how the democracy system in India ensures proper representation for all different religions and ensures that that there is no discrimination against any particular religion and all religions are equal. Sir, do you really think that the leaders of the country today have ensured that the secular fabric of the nation is intact and that there is complete equality for all all religions?
Sir, thank you for the question. My entire argument was based around the fact that the notion of democracy, that the idea that in a country with such a large plethora of religions, cultures, where there's such number of groups and sects, conflict is more prevalent. There is more chance of conflict, right? So when there is a chance of representation, people are more assured that their voice is getting through to the people who make decisions. That is the sole idea behind my argument here today, that democracy ensures that all of these people with different social facets, different religions, have a chance to get their word through, that they do not feel left out or cornered.
Right. Right. With that, no, I don't think we'll be taking a follow-up. We'll be moving on to the next speech. We will, which is from Anirudh. Anirudh, are you with us?
Yeah.
Right. The judges, are you all ready as well? Yeah. So, Anirudh, with that, you have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So the topic on the hammer reads that India needs a benevolent dictator. And I, being the third speaker of side proposition, it is my utmost prerogative to prove to you that India definitely needs a benevolent ruler. 73 years have passed since our independence, and parties have come and gone. And what has happened is scams taking place after again and again, rich becoming richer and poor getting poorer. So let us understand the concept of a benevolent dictatorship. A benevolent dictatorship is a form of government in which an authoritarian leader exercises absolute political power over the state, but is seen to do so for the benefit of the population as a whole. A benevolent dictator may allow for some economic liberalization or democratic decision making to exist, such as through public referendum or elected representative with limited power. What happens in a democracy is, in the garb of staying in power, people manifest their parties manifest their own USP rather than doing something for the country. And in a dictatorship, the strong leader will do something for the country and bring about economic development. And let us see what happened in the current COVID-19 crisis. States states governed by different political parties are keeping skeletons in the closet. They aren't providing proper statistical data just to show their competency, that they were able to control COVID-19 crisis at the best. But that is not true. Keeping skeletons in the closet or not providing proper accurate data violates the principles of democracy. And furthermore, we are having conflicts inside institutions. For example, the CBI was a CBI conflict. We had this because both the CBI officials, the CBI dictator and CBI deputy director were part of different political parties. Point number 3. Even in the COVID crisis, industries have been shut down in China, and instead of coming to India, they've gone to countries like Vietnam, just because the Indian government does not support industries, as in the case of Vodafone. Different industries have seen this example of Vodafone and are demoralized to come to India. And what and overpopulation is a lingering problem in India and needs to be controlled. And what we need to do this is a one child policy or a two child policy, which can only take place under a dictatorship, a benevolent dictatorship. And under a democracy where people have all the freedoms, it will not take place. In a country like India, where poverty is a aggravating problem, in such a case, it would be a luxury to spend 60,000 crores on elections. We have the costliest elections in the world. Dictatorship, in such a case, is a more economic institution in such matter. In India, law and order is disrupted time and time again, and dictatorship is definitely going to help out. Even in the 21st century, molestation and rape cases are increasing day by day, and India therefore needs a strong, benevolent dictator to stop this. A dictator, being the all-power head of the state, will face no opposition and face no opposition from the political parties, as in the case of democracy. So he'll be able to
30
bring out
seconds.
what
30 seconds, carry on.
he'll be able to bring out economic development. And therefore we see that the Indian population is not that educated to live in a democracy. They don't know what to ask from a democratic government. They don't know what whom they need to vote, what do they want from such a developing country, how do we need to progress. In such a case, having a benevolent dictator is essential. With this, I'm very proud to propose.
With a pinpoint ending to your speech, thank you, Anirudh. We will now be taking questions from the floor. We will begin with Jay and then revert back to the judges. Jay, your question.
Oh, sir, thank you for the speech. So the term benevolent is very subjective. So who sets the parameters for what benevolent means? And what if the people think that, what if the people's opinion of benevolence differs from that of the dictator? Then what?
So benevolent, I understand that benevolent is a very subjective term, but but the population of India isn't that stupid that they can't understand what the benevolent leader ulterior motives are. If his ulterior motives are against the policies of the country, we'll definitely ask for a referendum to remove that benevolent dictator to replace him with another benevolent dictator which the country supports. Thank you.
Can I follow up?
Yes, I think we can take a follow up and then we'll revert back to the judges.
So, benevolent dictator goes beyond saying that he's kind and does what the people like. What if the dictator disagrees on how to take a particular action, say how to deal with COVID-19? Then what you and I did think?
So
Then
the
let me complete the question. Then do you still think the dictator would be benevolent? Because in his eyes, he is benevolent.
So the entire concept of benevolent dictatorship is the dealer will do something for the benefit of the population. He'll do something for the benefit of the country and not his own ulterior motives or to promote himself or sell his own USP. He'll work and do stuff for the benefit of the country, for economic development of the country, for the people to progress as a whole. Thank you. That's the concept of benevolent dictatorship as a whole.
Right. With that, we will now revert back to the judges. Ryan, Komakuli, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Komal, do you have one?
Yeah,
I
I
got
do.
two.
Can we
I
both
got
ask
Okay,
him
fine.
one
I'll just.
question
I
each?
mean, fair enough, fair enough.
Okay,
We'll
okay.
start with Ryan and move on to Komakuli.
Okay, so Anirudh, I
Yeah.
think there's a more fundamental question at hand. Apart from looking at the need aspect, how do you propose that a dictator is brought about in the first place? For example, you want a dictatorship where the proletariat class rises up, or a dictatorship where the constitution is changed. So, how do you plan to bring about dictatorship in the first place that will, control the power or absolute political power that you talked about?
So the point is, India needs a benevolent ruler. India needs something. I'm not saying that this concept is practical in India to persist, but the matter of debate is India needs a benevolent ruler, and we are debating on that. I'm not saying that we will be able to have a benevolent ruler in India. We're just saying that India needs one of the benevolent dictators. I'm not saying that we'll be able to have a benevolent dictator in India.
Right. Now, thank you for answering that question. We will now take the next question from Komakuli.
Yeah, Anurag, my simple question to you is, you said that India needs a benevolent dictator, and how the Indian population isn't educated or literate enough to vote and thus function in democracy. So just give me in one line, are you fundamentally against the universal adult franchise?
In the current scenario, in the current economic scenario, yes.
All right, fair enough.
All right. With that, thank you, Anirudh. Thank you, Komakuli. Thank you, Ryan. We will now move on to the next speech, which is from Pranit. Pranit, are you with us?
Yeah.
Right.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. I would request everyone to mute their mics because I am getting some audio feedback. Right, that's better. So we will, Pranit, you have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
So the entirety of the props arguments today have rested on the assumption that a benevolent dictator will take India out of its crisis, that such a dictator will be ideally wise, supreme, and able to enact all the right policies. So essentially, and the proposition has already ceded that such a dictatorship is completely unrealistic and unpractical. So what the proposition is essentially saying today is an extremely trivial and cowardly point. They're saying that an ideal leader would be good for India. Even taking that into consideration, we can point out some of the areas in which the proposition has made flaws in their arguments. The proposition has necessarily resorted to certain historical examples such as Yugoslavia, Singapore, and Turkey. Right. Now, we believe that this cherry picking of examples is flawed for two important reasons. One is that the majority of dictatorships throughout history have been flawed they've come from the African diaspora, they have led to worse economic development than the country was beforehand. Secondly, we believe that this sort of cherry picking is in retrospect. We can tell whether or not these decisions succeeded based on looking backwards from history with that historical perspective. And thus we can say that Singapore happened to have a benevolent dictatorship. Now, even if we consider countries like South Korea and Singapore, considering the fact that failure is the rule for dictatorships and not success, even if we take these exceptions, let me show you why they won't work for India. Sir, Ronak, a country like Turkey or Singapore could be elevated to an autocracy which was successful because political conditions existed, right? Not just economic conditions. We believe that the political conditions for an autocracy to arise in India are simply not prevalent. Even if we consider your claim that the economic conditions are prevalent, let's consider this very important fact. Countries like Korea, the Republic of Korea recovering from the Korean War, were in actual times of economic hardship, which were much more amplified and much worse off than India is today, even though you claim that India is currently in an economic crisis. Please consider that from that point of absolute economic destitution, these countries were able to carry out growth, which was. Please understand that there's a difference between two types of growth, right? There's catching up growth and there's cutting edge growth. Countries like South Korea have enacted catching up growth, in which they've become as economically secure as countries in the West, largely through borrowing technology, which was already available, which has been developed in the West. This is very different from cutting edge growth, which countries like the US carries out. Now, we believe that India in the 70 years till the present date has already carried out much of the catching up growth, which leads to you claiming that an autocracy will be good for economic development. We believe that we simply are not in the conditions, even economically, for an autocracy to succeed. And secondly, let's actually construct a model of how an autocracy will come to power in India, since the proposition has failed to do so and already said that it is impractical. An autocracy relies on the leader having a group of close allies, such as the military dictatorship in Brazil or the communist or the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, right? These close allies preserve the interests of the dictator and provide responsive feedback to him through keeping him accountable. Please understand that in India, such an autocracy and such a transition will necessarily be majoritarian. It is highly likely to invoke Hindutva or a Hindu hegemonic way of living. We believe that such an ideology will necessarily exclude minorities such as minorities, for the simple reason that if they did include such minorities, this could more or less reduce to the same system of democracy which we have present today. And thus, autocracies cannot succeed in India today and are not good.
Right. Thank you, Pranit. With that, we will now take questions from the floor. We will take Ranak's question.
So first, Praneeth, addressing your catching up point, what we have to see is that you cited examples of South Korea and Singapore, and that they, from complete economic destitution, have only caught up. But do you really believe that countries like Singapore and South Korea are not one of the most highly rated countries in the world in terms of human and economic development? Singapore being one of the most metropolitan cities, which lacking prior culture, lacking any history or any historical base, through this, let's say this dictatorship, this benevolent dictatorship, has emerged to become one of the most respected and one of the most developed countries in the world. From that state of destitution which you have stated. So I think that clearly proves that even like if a benevolent dictatorship can take a failing state from destitution to a cutting edge and a world-renowned status, why can it not take India, which has already done the catching up process, to a world-renowned and a developed status?
Because
what makes it?
Because of the very simple reason that the conditions in Singapore and India are very different. As I mentioned in my model of how an Indian autocracy, an Indian democracy would actually take place, it would require the leadership to be surrounded by allies which would promote its own ideology, right? Something on majoritarian lines. And this would actually exacerbate inequalities which are already present in society, for the simple reason that it would be the interests of that dictatorship and its allies to preserve their own interests, which would be largely Hindu, casteist, and divided on similar lines. Inequalities such as the reason why many Muslims aren't able to ascend to positions of leadership, because of the simple reason that they come from communities without privilege, which are exposed to bias. These conditions would only exacerbate. The inequalities which are present in India would exacerbate under dictatorship, and it would not follow the same path which Singapore has.
So,
can I
follow up, or will somebody else ask the question?
Right. I think we leave this one on the judges. Do you all want to hear the follow-up or another question? Komukuli, your mic is muted. I can't hear what you're saying.
I think there's like two more people who want to ask questions. Can we let them?
Yeah, that's cool.
Only if you. Yeah, fair enough. So we will
the
take
other questions.
the questions from Ishan and Ave, and then.
Thank you, Suri. Praneeth, you talked about the Korean dictator, right? And how, you talked about how meritocratic he was. Do you believe, in purview of today's motion, that the Korean dictator was benevolent?
In South Korea, I believe that he could be seen as the kind of benevolent dictator that the motion requires. Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. With that, we will now take Ava's question. Ava.
Yeah. So Pranit, the first 3 minutes of your speech was consumed in you describing why you believe that the conditions in India are not ideal to support the rise of an autocracy. Sir, considering the fact that the motion is India needs a benevolent dictator and not India can get a benevolent dictator, don't you believe that's irrelevant?
I do not believe that's irrelevant, because considering the fact that I'm opposing the motion, which the proposition has largely depended by pointing out flaws in the current democracy and the current system of government, and by jumping to the conclusion that a benevolent dictator would automatically get rid of those flaws and problems without actually providing a link as to why autocracy outperforms democracy in that regard, I do not believe that that's an issue with my speech.
Quite the answer there, Pranit. Thank you for the question, Ave. We will now move on to the next speaker, which is Ishan. Ishan, are you ready?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are, for a change.
Thank you.
Right.
God, don't insult me, Suri. Please.
He's insulting your internet, not you.
Yeah, dude. Okay, fine.
Anyway, all
Accept
jokes
him.
apart. Yeah, all jokes apart. You have 4 minutes on the clock.
Right.
The floor is yours.
Very good evening to ladies and gentlemen, everyone present here. Now, I would like to begin by ripping apart the opposition's argument as to how, a dictatorship a benevolent dictatorship might turn into an autocracy, might be that there'll be a clampdown. Let's understand that this debate today is not about what happens later. It is not about whether the dictator will turn out to be something. This house has accepted a virtue, accepting that, for example, a person X is benevolent, and whether a country like as great or as diverse as India deserves a benevolent dictatorship or not. Let's also understand how the opposition has been very weak in describing what benevolent is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's understand that benevolency does not mean that you cannot be meritocratic or you cannot have no rule. Talking about what Eklobbo talked about, the opposition, he focused on how dictatorship is inherently unstable, how there is concentration of power no matter what. And in a country like India, let's understand today, the good thing, whether at the top, whether it be a democracy or whether it be dictatorship, there can never be an absolute control. Might have an absolute control in a distributed manner or a distributed control. That is why we are not debating on any kind of dictator. We are debating about a benevolent dictator who would decentralize the control. Let's understand that in a country like India actually plans its policies with long-term challenges, long-term goals for democracy. They design plans which are, which extend up to 30, 40 years after the plan has actually been made in the future. Let's understand that our policies incentivize long-term working. Also talking about the elections, wherein for a period of 5 years the elected government is in power. Let's understand that the first year is already spent in setting up the government, setting up the institutions and all these things. Let's understand that the last year is already spent on making sure that you win the election for the next term. Understand that 3 years is not enough for a country as great as India to make decisions, to make policies, and thus what the Indian government does is make popular decisions. I will come to that later. Talking about a benevolent dictator, let's compare our benevolent dictator to a CEO of a company. Let's understand that the CEO makes all the calls, but he doesn't necessarily own the company. There are shareholders, and all the shareholders are similarly, similarly in the form of institutions. When we are talking about India, shareholders cannot do day-to-day management of the company. Thus, during bad times, they can replace the CEO. That is the kind of benevolent dictatorship we are talking about. As Ranak mentioned about, mentioned but did not talk about the founder of Singapore. That is the basis of this difference between Lee Kuan Yew and Robert Mugabe. Praneeth talked about about how there was a political condition during the founding of Singapore. I would like to elaborate on that. Let's understand that the founder of Singapore came with a vision, and he gains his authority from the authority of the masses. If it wasn't implicit, then the dictatorship would have failed. He, after coming to power, did not kill journalists or did not clamp down the freedom of speech or clamp down the other rights, just as the opposition has been picking up examples from the past. Jay talked about the loss of accountability. Let's understand that the problem with the charade of this democracy is that it really confuses people as to where the authority really lies, and and where this authority really, where it makes them accountable. We essentially live in a democracy where Prime Minister Modi has far more power than he's actually accountable for. We have tried democratic experiences, different cases to be made while we are talking about this. We need to keep in mind that when we are talking about a benevolent dictator, he has a good intention.
Wrap up.
Right. Lastly, talking about, what I talked about, the unpopular decisions, the dictators are needed to take unpopular decisions, which a democracy doesn't make. Why doesn't India democracy mend this crisis? Because the government would have decisions implemented or policies implemented, which would be popular, to have popular support and majority support. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ishan. With that brilliant internet connection that we saw today, we will now take question on Ishan's speech. We will start with Shinjoy and revert back to the judges.
Right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. So in your speech, you claim that India has already failed as a democracy, and you give some examples, one of which was that Narendra Modi holds more power than he is accountable of. But so considering that this topic is about an idealistic society of a benevolent dictator, then at the same time, why, as a parallel, why not considering the ideal philosophy of a benevolent democracy to go along with it?
Thank you for that question, Shinjoy. I don't believe that there is something so idealistic as a benevolent dictator, number one. And number two, what addressing your question is basically what we see here is, for example, Mr. Modi is given the power far beyond what he's accountable for. He takes a decision. Now, what this dirty game of politics of India does is basically BJP, in that matter, evades the responsibility off its shoulder and puts the blame on somebody else. Now, when we have a benevolent dictator placed in place of such a leader of a democracy, what happens is that the people are clear about the source of authority, about the source of the decision, and a person who they can hold accountable for. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Right. With that, the judges, do you have a question, or should we take some more from the floor?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Ishan, you tried to define the parameters of what a benevolent dictatorship should look like, and you used some words in there that went along the line of decentralization. So my question is that in the 1990s, when Mikhail Gorbachev he came to power in the Soviet Union, he tried to decentralize the system and tried to be a benevolent dictator of sorts. And we know what that led to, what the consequences of that were. So, how do you plan to incorporate a decentralized system into a
Yeah.
dictatorship?
Thank you, Ryan. You take the example of Mikhail Gorbachev. I take the example of Jawaharlal Nehru. He was not more than, and he was not any less than a benevolent dictator, wherein he had the power. He had the enormous number of power to take decisions. And let's understand that what actually defines a benevolent dictator. As I said, it can't be that they can't be meritocratic, they can't be ruling, they have to rule. And to rule, let's understand that decentralization is you need to assign powers to the bureaucracy. For example, as I said, the shareholders also have a power. It doesn't have to be that one person has all the power, he's making the decisions, he's clamping down on it. No, it doesn't have to be that. It can be based on it can be based on how you're thinking about the people. And also pointing out to Ryan, we have today's debate is also taking place in a purview of a good intention. We need to focus on the good intention of the dictator, of the benevolent dictator, right? We cannot focus on how it will go on to be autocratic, how or whether it will go on to be something else. No, it's not that. Do I have time, Suri, to give an example? Or
I
no?
would, I
Time's up.
would, I would recommend you don't. If the judges allow it, sure.
If the judges allow, then sure. Ryan and Komal Kohli.
It's Kohli's call. It's
It's
not my
Kohli's
call.
call.
Would you like to hear the rest of the questions instead, or hear a statement from Ishan because he's already given his speech?
Yeah, I'd rather have Pranit ask his question.
Right. Pranit, your question.
Right.
Considering that the good intention which defines a benevolent dictator doesn't exactly ensure that his policies will be for the best interest of the country, and considering that you do not actually propose for an actual benevolent dictatorship, since you have assumed that Nehru himself counts as one, when in fact that is technically a democracy. Why do you wish to define your dictatorship as merely a decentralized system of government, not dissimilar from today's democracy? Yeah, that's my question. Why don't you take a stronger stance on that?
Because of the fact that it ensures more accountability. Would you like one person taking the decisions, having being the source of all being okay? You want to go on. If
So your solution for the lack of accountability is to replace a democracy with a system where technically there is no positive feedback loop, where there is no checks and balances.
To remove your misconception, that is why we have the term benevolent, Pranit. That is what I'm talking about. We cannot compare a normal dictator like maybe some random dictator who for example any dictator for that matter, Robert Mugabe, who just came to steal the black diamonds from his territory. That can't be our example for today's debate. There is always a parameter and parallelistic argument that needs to be made with it. We cannot generalize. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Right. With that, thank you, Ishan, thank you, Pranit, and thank you for the questions. We will now move on to the last speech before we move on to the first two speakers for the second half of the speech, which is Shinjoy. Shinjoy, can you hear me?
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Shinjoy, you have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Right. So an implicit assumption that has been incorporated into the argument of each and every member of side proposition today is that a benevolent dictator always makes the right decisions, the good decisions for the people of that country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what does the word benevolent means? It means well-meaning or kindly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, understand that just because someone is well-meaning or kindly does not always necessarily mean that he will take the decisions that are right or good for the people of the country. Let us take into consideration Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He can also be described as a benevolent person because what decisions he took, he believed those decisions to be for the good of India at that point of time. But as we can say in hindsight, those decisions actually were detrimental to the progress of India. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these considerations, these parallels, these examples can only be taken in hindsight. But when a benevolent dictator is making a decision which he considers to be a benevolent decision, there is no way of actually knowing what the outcome of that decision will be, whether it actually turns out to be good for the country at large. Now, understand that m- a member of the proposition came up with the argument that dictators make decisions fast and there is no need for a futile bureaucracy system and there are no checks and balances. But, ladies and gentlemen, understand that a benevolent dictator might be doing what he thinks is for the good of the people, but as I've already stated before, there's always the scope for human error. Human error is always present. A benevolent dictator is not God. He is not free from these errors. So just because he is benevolent does not mean that we will assume that he will not make any errors. Someone else stated that benevolent dictators should only be there during certain times of crisis and during other times they will be democracy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is why something called an emergency exists in India. Emergency means that that such exceptional powers will be given to the democratic leaders during the times of crisis, and this is a feature of a democracy and not a feature of a dictatorship. So if this is the feature that is being wanted by side proposition today, then what they're actually rooting for is a democracy and not a dictatorship. Also, an argument that has been placed is that dictators will be temporary and that they will step down by themselves. Again, scope for human error. How can a dictator possibly know when it is right to step down for himself? It can be his intuition, but there's no way of being 100% certain. Another speaker of side proposition has stated that overpopulation is one of the main problems that India is facing and that needs to be controlled, and only dictators will do that because it will be a hard call. Now, understand that this controlling of overpopulation is something that Rajiv Gandhi had tried uh, in during the emergency period, and this is one of the most widely criticized things that had happened in the emergency, criticized by the international community as a large. And considering that even the international community has criticized it, in hindsight we cannot truly say that this was a benevolent step. Also understand that seeing how brutal a process this is, a benevolent, that is a kindly or a well-meaning leader, will never actually adopt this process. Ladies
30
and gentlemen,
seconds.
right, we must also consider that a fundamental feature of democracy is the federal structure. That is, power is divided not only between the center and the states, but also to panchayats, districts, and so on and so forth. Now, understand that when all that power is given to just one dictator at the center, especially in a large and diverse country like India, he cannot possibly know the problems of each and every section of and each and every strata of Indian society. So there is no way that
Shinjoy, wrap up.
right. So there is no way that he can be benevolent and make decisions for the good of all the people when he does not know the problems that all the people are facing. Thank you.
Right. With that, thank you very much, Shinjoy.
Please,
We
please, please, please.
as much as I would have wanted to give you the question, because you have already given a speech and answered several questions, we will take a question from Ranak and revert back to the judges to see if they would accept another question.
Right. So Srinjoy, thank you for highlighting every single point of every single pre-speaker from the proposition. But my question stands that after 73 years of what could be described as failed democracy and having to declare multiple emergencies of supposed to be an infallible constitution, what would you prefer right now in this crisis? A corruption-plagued, nepotistic parliament making your laws, or a good or a person who is a dictator but has the correct intentions? Which one do you think has more of a probability of succeeding? Because 73 years of historic evidence has showed that the former, this nepotistic, corruption-plagued parliament has failed. So what do you have to say? What do you have to? How can you defend this democracy?
Right, sir. So another argument made by not only you but all the speakers of side proposition in general is that this nepotistic system of government that is currently ongoing in India has failed, right? But so my question to the House is, since we are already considering a utopian situation of a benevolent dictator and saying that this utopian benevolent dictator will be better than the democracy that we currently possess, then why do we not compare this utopian benevolent dictator with another concept of a benevolent democracy. Now understand that essentially you're pointing out the flaws in the democracy that India currently has, but these are not flaws in the notions of democracy. So when you ask me this question referring to India's current situation, you need to ask me this question referring to the idea of a benevolent democracy, a democracy which takes into account the good of the people, because, ladies and gentlemen, these are the parallels.
Right.
I can't follow up, can
I would only if the judges allow it.
I? Everybody else has a question, no?
Yes.
Oh yeah, everybody has a question, so I won't follow up.
Right. Thank you, Ronak, for considering. We will now revert back to the judges. Comically, Ryan, do you want to hear the questions from Anirudh and Ishan, or ask a question yourself? Ryan, comically.
Let Ishan
No,
have
no,
a
let
question if I'm fine with it.
Yeah, right.
let the others ask.
Right.
Oh,
So
sure.
we'll
Kumukuli has a
first
question.
take, yeah,
No,
two
no,
people
no,
have
no.
a question. So we'll take a question from Anirudh and then lastly Ishan before we move on to the next two speakers.
So, so you mentioned that the one-child policy is a non-benevolent policy, but the fact that China introduced this policy and has progressed so much after that, don't you think it's a don't how do you believe that it's a non-benevolent policy after a country has progressed so much after that?
Right. So suffice to say, you really do not know your history. When I talked about the steps taken by Rajiv Gandhi to curtail the overpopulation during the period of emergency, this is not a one-step policy, but the steps which he took was the forced sterilization of males to ensure that the overpopulation problem India faced would be lessened.
Right. After that history lesson, we will now move on to Ishan's question. Ishan,
Okay.
question.
Considering the fact that it wasn't Rajiv Gandhi with the one-child policy, it was Sanjay Gandhi. I will give you a situation, as to what you said, by meaning that for a dictator, it is basically how will they look at the others, small every section of the society. That's what. So, for example, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which gained just 23% support from all over India, which means it had majority support. So tell me that in a democracy, the dam was never built and is not going to be built because a few environmental stakeholders are stopping the country from doing it. So do you believe that? Tell me, is there any way to stop environmental harm, or is there any way to make a fast economic growth without environmental harm in these cases? Tell me this.
Right. So again, so you must consider that to make an economy better, it is economic development and not just economic growth that we are looking at, as all of us have already studied in economics. Simply pursuing economic growth while completely ignoring the costs of development that come along at this stage is not actually beneficial for a country, and the that is why we focus on human development index and other such economic development indices, and not just the GDP of a country. And therefore, when you're talking about the increasing the fast growth of the economy, that cannot be the only consideration that a democracy is going to make, because it always needs to take the costs of development into account.
Suryansh, can I please have a follow-up on that?
Only if Ryan or
You will
comically
address
approve.
the
Right.
point.
Right. Before that, I have like clarification. Are you allowed to ask questions via the chat box?
No,
That's only clarification.
that is only for clarifications, and nothing on the chat box is to be marked by the judges.
Right. Fair enough.
And
Would Brian Kohli, would you
yeah,
encourage,
questions. The follow up from Ishan. Would you all?
please?
I think it's adequately answered.
Fair enough. They I think they have understood your question and his answer. So I think it is only fair to move on. Uh, so we will now go back to the very first speaker who has the second half of his speech to go, which was Ave. Ave, you had 2 minutes remaining. Are you ready?
Yes.
Suryansh, are there questions on these speeches?
Yes, there will be one.
Okay.
Uh, so, Ave, are you ready?
Yes.
Right. You have 2 minutes for the final time for you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Eklavya, in his answer to my question, had said that awareness about the political process can be easily generated because there are 500 million active internet users. Sir, you cannot generate awareness, proper awareness about the political process simply by sending a message to someone over the internet. It requires years of education. It requires them to. It requires a fundamental change in in the way they think about the political process. So it can't just happen at the drop of a hat. It takes a period of time, and that is why we need a benevolent dictator to act and ensure that something like that happens over a period of time. Then after that, Jay had said that people should have control over themselves and their government, and I agree, people should, but only if the people can understand the nitty gritties of policy. And right now, people in India don't have the education and the abilities necessary to understand what is best for them and what is best for the country as a whole, and they don't have the expertise to understand the complex elements of policy, and that is why we need someone to make those decisions for them. Furthermore, he said that benevolent is a subjective term
1 minute to go.
and cannot be considered benevolent by all the people. Sir, no political leader can be considered good by all the people. That is also one of the tenets, even in democracy. Even a democratic government will not be considered good or benevolent by all of the people. It will have supporters and it will have dissenters. Furthermore, Pranit had said that we are cherry picking the motion has given us certain parameters. It's telling us to talk about benevolent dictatorships, and that is why we're giving you examples of benevolent dictatorships to show you that benevolent dictatorships are good for a country. Then Srinjoy spoke about Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Sir, that is an example of cherry picking dictatorships. There are so many successful benevolent dictators, and he has picked the one isolated example of the failure of a benevolent dictator. And sir, the point, Suryansh, please stop laughing. I need to. Okay. Yeah. So he has picked the one example of a failed benevolent dictator, and the reason Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a bad benevolent dictator was because he
Wrap up.
was in power purely because he was the child of the previous dictator. That would not take place in a benevolent dictatorship.
All right. With that, thank you, Ave. Quite the refutation you made. Quite a few
Suryansh,
points.
you're not letting me. You're laughing, and I can't.
I think you made quite a few points while ignoring my
That man
laughter.
is
So
laughing because of a different.
you have brownie points on my behalf. I can tell you that much. But yes, thank you, and we will take one question from the floor. We will take the question from Jay, and then move on to the judges. Jay, your question.
So simple yes or no question. Do you believe that people who don't have adequate or years of education that you believe they must have to choose their lead, to participate in the political process, do you think they do not have the right to choose their way of life, choose their leader, and should have a person decide what is good for them and what is bad for them? Simple yes or no.
I think Ave is having network errors or is playing statue.
Now who's poor?
I think this makes Ishan quite happy because last
Now
time
who's poor?
his leg
That's
was
India.
being
That's why we need a benevolent dictator.
his leg was being pulled because by Ave for having poor internet connectivity, and we will be back after a small break when Ave returns. All right, everyone, we are back, and this time we are not communicating with Ave through the internet, but we are communicating with him through a phone call. I have Ave here with me. He will respond to the question, a question that is addressed to him. I believe we had recognized Jay. Jay, your question.
So simple yes or no question. Do you believe that according to you, the people who don't have the adequate amount of education to participate in the political process, they should be denied the right to choose their own way of life, their own leader, and have someone else make decisions for them?
Ave, did you get that?
Thank you for your question, sir. I believe that those people should be given the necessary education, the necessary ability to make these decisions for themselves. But obviously, as the current scenario, due to the current scenario in India, we don't have people with that level of education and with that level of understanding of the nitty-gritties of policy. We need a period of time where people are actually taught these essential things, and only after that should they be allowed to choose their own leaders, because at the current moment they're not choosing them based on their policy, they're choosing them based on meaningless rhetoric.
Right. Thank you, Ave. Do the judges have a question, Ryan or Kohli?
No, we don't have.
Would
I
you
don't
like
think
to
we have.
take Shinjoy's question, or can we move on because it was a 2-minute speech?
I think we should move on.
I don't mind taking a question from Sanjay.
He doesn't mind taking a question from Shinjoy, but judges, would you like to move forward now?
Yeah, I think we should move on.
Right. Aware, the judges have decided to move forward with the debate. Right. So we will now move on to the next speaker, which is the final speech of the evening, which is from Ekalabya. Yes, Aware.
I kind of have to go now. I'll debate.
Right. Thank you for joining, Ave. The judges have heard what they've had to hear, and yeah, I look forward to you coming back soon. And yeah.
I look forward to coming back.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Right. Now that Ave has left, we will now move on to the next speech because I don't see how we're going to be able to ask him a question now. So we will end today's debate with Akalabya's speech. Akalabya, are you with us?
Yeah.
Right.
So,
go ahead.
So the member, Ave had mentioned that democracy has a serious tendency, as he countered with his point that if a benevolent dictator is like, if the people don't agree with him, they can dissent against him, they can hold a different opinion, and even like question him. Now he mentioned the features of a democracy. How is he expecting to dissent to occur against a dictator in a dictatorial regime? Because he's rather like offering the existence of a dictator in a democracy, which is very much contradictory. Secondly, Ronak mentioned about nepotistic trends in the Indian democracy. Well, I will agree with him, but I would like to point out that historically nepotism in politics is very much more evident in dictatorial regimes than in democratic regimes. I don't have many much points to put forward because, well, Anirudh mentioned about one-child policy in China, which has led to development. I'd like to put forward this point that is he aware of the fact now that currently China is literally forcing its women to have more than one child and even promoting a society which ridicules women which has one child and forces them to at least have more than a child? And I would like to I'd like to wrap up by pointing this forward that almost every member of the proposition agreed on the fact that benevolent dictatorship is something that India needs, but something it cannot have. So I would like to ask all of them, with a practical crisis in our hand, in the practical crisis in the Indian democracy, why are they putting forward something so much utopian and idealistic which cannot be literally achieved in this such a diverse country?
Right. Thank you, Ekalabya. We will now take a question from the floor. We'll take Ranak's question. Ranak?
Yeah. Eklavya, could you just give me one example of a nepotistic benevolent dictatorship? As you stated that basically nepotism exists in democracy, but moment you become a dictatorship, it exists more. It is much more of a problem. I would just like a single example.
Like you want me to give an example of nepotism in a dictatorial regime, right?
In a benevolent dictatorship, that's the premise for today. Oh God, is he looking it up? What?
Ekalabya, I think he's having some connectivity issues. Yeah, it's connectivity issues.
I believe he's muted
your mic,
himself.
you've muted your mic, Ekalabya. If
Sorry,
you
just
could.
a second. How do we answer the question?
Sorry. Like a phone call
Just a
came and
second.
the mic got muted. I'm extremely sorry.
Right.
So,
Go.
sir, as you have asked for an example of having a benevolent dictatorial regime which has showed nepotism. Well, I would
Yeah.
definitely agree with you that a benevolent dictatorial regime, the few and the rare ones which have been recorded on the face of earth, haven't
Yeah.
shown nepotistic trends. But I would like to put forward, India is a very much more diverse country than Singapore or Yugoslavia. We have a much more diverse population and a large surface area compared to them. So, in a country which has such a diverse population with multiple religions and linguistic communities, it would be really difficult for one benevolent dictator to put forward the ideas of community and even step out when necessary to accommodate the ideas of other communities and let again democracy triumph over him.
How is that nepotism?
No.
What?
There is no reason for the interruption. No crosstalk, please.
Explain another question.
Judges, would you like to entertain another question, or shall we move on?
Yes. Yeah. We can go ahead with another.
So,
Right. So for the last question of the evening, Ishan, wrap it up.
right. So, thank you, Suri. Ekalabbo, considering the fact that you're a member of the opposition, and just tell me something that do you believe in the fact that a democracy, the government, basically, government of a democracy, 99% of the times takes popular decisions that is in support of what their party ideologies believe, and just to ensure that they win the elections. Like, for example, I'll give you an example, like banning of beef was banned in UP, but it was not banned in Kerala. But we need a dictator to take unpopular decisions to unlock all the things that are locked away. So do you believe that, okay, yes, this is democratic government often takes popular decisions just for this pursuit?
Can you please repeat your last part of the question because it got
Do
hard
you
to
believe
hear.
that our government, the Indian government, or for that matter, any government on earth, takes popular decisions, takes decisions that will get them majority support, and locks away those unpopular decisions that can be made to unlock a new future for the country? And I gave the example of banning of beef.
Ishan, like I told you earlier, please shorter
I just
questions.
precipitated the question for him. I just asked him whether
Right.
he believes or not.
Yeah.
So, what's your question, sir?
I just asked the question that
You said
whether you
whether I believe that whether I believe
that the government or any government takes popular decisions which get them majority support and lock away those unpopular decisions which might unlock a new future for the country. And I gave the example of banning of beef. Do you believe in it?
okay. Yes, so I do believe that governments do tend to take populist decisions, but I would like to put this forward very much straight and forwardly that democracy is not only about the government's decision, it's also about the society and how people accept them. A democracy at least gives chance to the people to at least protest against it, people to question the government's decision, whether even a benevolent dictatorship, just because of the basic ideology of a dictatorship, doesn't let the people to engage in dissent and discourse.
Okay, no follow-ups. That was the policy. But just a question, informally, Suri Eklobbo mentioned a question at the end of his speech. How can we answer?
I don't. Let's just take it as a rhetoric.
Next session.
Yes, actually. So yeah, thank you guys. Thank you guys. I hope you'll enjoyed. Is there anything the participants would like to say before we move forward to the judges and the results?
Yeah, maybe.
Sure. Go ahead.
Like, what do you expect me to say? That's all. That's
Anything you want to. What did you think about the debate, so on and so forth?
Oh, what did I think about the debate? The debate was really productive. And this is Zoom, so it has some security leaks. If this goes to the BJP government, we're crapped.
Basically, Suryansh is recording this
Unless it's
Yeah,
very
YouTube.
it is. So that's the one thing, and that's the flaw of democracy.
So if
That
the owner of Zoom is Chinese, it won't go to the BJP for sure.
I'm
At most, it
compromised
will go
for
to
me.
Jinping.
definitely go to the BJP.
Interesting. Maybe we
No,
can
but
have
I
a
really
debate
like
about
the
that.
debate today, considering the fact that it was really productive on both sides. Like I could hear new arguments from both sides, and I really liked it
The
how the opposition could not prove their point but prove their point. I mean, it was a good balancing act.
Thank you for that.
Fair enough. Is there anything anyone else would like to say before we move to the judges?
Judges or anyone, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyone. Praneeth, Shinjoy, anyone.
Point out that Ryan asked a very important question, which is how he wanted how they wanted the transition to take place, and I think that in ignoring all of these practical issues, like how this autocracy would actually occur, and by resorting to the line that the motion ensures a benevolent, perfect dictatorship, they've actually ignored much of the practical conditions which would have allowed that benevolent dictatorship to have existed in the first place.
Right. Well, I think we should just move on to the judges if no one else has something to say. So I think is there anything you'd like to say about the debate you witnessed, Ryan and Komal Kohli, or
I mean, do you want both of
Kamakoli, why
us
don't
to
you
say
start?
something?
yeah, I mean, sure.
Okay. I
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
thought that the
Yeah,
content
Kamal.
was pretty good. And like it was very close. Like if you see my mark sheet, it's super close. I thought everyone was really great, and it was really nice to see like people who are really good at speaking in general. Like leaving aside like content and arguments, just people who are really fluent and good at speaking. So I think it was like all in all really good, fun evening activity.
Right. And thank you, Komal Kohli, for your kind words. And Ryan, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, it was my first time, and I had a wonderful experience. I think you're doing a great job organizing these debates during the lockdown.
Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you very
yeah.
much. Yeah.
So the thing is that the motion was a little bit tilted towards the uh, opposition, I can say, because it is easier to argue what democracy is about and how democracy can be maintained, and that the proposition had to like go in depth and talk about the parameters of a benevolent dictatorship, which is not that much different from the democracy that we're arguing. However, yeah, I brought about that question that Pranit also mentioned about. I think the proposition, I think when you're defining what a dictatorship is about, I think how it came to power is also very important. I think that point was missed upon. The speakers missed it, but it was a very important debate. I think in terms of the crisis and where we are right now, and I think everyone did a great job because like everyone can speak extremely well. I think I was very surprised by that. They can speak and handle questions very well, and I think the only thing lacking in my opinion was in terms of content and humor and wit, which is what makes every debate uh, lively. Humor and wit can always make a difference. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
thank you for your kind
There's
words.
also not a lack of time, Ryan, along with the lack of wit and humor.
Right. I mean, we had a little bit of humor with your internet connection and what
Oh my
happened, and the
god, Ryan,
other
go.
debacle. uh, anyway, and before we move on to the results that the judges have to declare, I'd just like to mention this episode of The Floor is Yours was also in cooperation with Discourse, another organization that was started by Ishan actually, through whom we have Ekalabya and Jay joining us. Thank you, Ishan, and we hope to be having some more
Thank you so much,
collaborations with you
guys.
coming up later.
Real fun.
Yeah, and yeah, I think without further ado, I think all of you are just waiting here just for Ryan and Kohli to give us the
Actually,
results.
Suri, before that, Ryan and Komal, if you could send in the results before that, like you've been tirelessly doing this for like, I don't know, past 5, 6 sessions. I'd really like to, put it forward that yeah, it's an amazing job you're doing. It's a very tireless thing you're doing every week, and you should do more of this. Being a senior, I can tell you, it's very very good that you're doing that. You're making us use our boring life to some some get some potential out of it.
So cute.
I mean, I swear, few people wake up at 2:30 in the afternoon. I swear, dude. Like that's how jobless we are.
Yeah, so I wake up at 2:30 so I can participate in this at 5.
Wow.
I woke up at 5. I woke up at 5.
Yeah,
You guys were
the,
waiting for me.
we started a little bit late because
Dude,
Anirudh,
Puri, who's looking the best here? Take a guess.
I
Anirudh in the house, dude. Sando Genji pore ache.
I agree. Right.
Recording is still
I'm not
Right,
on.
right,
wearing.
right.
I'm not wearing a vest. It's a sleeveless T-shirt, guys. It has a
Anirudh
print.
actually woke up at 5.
Right,
No,
right, right. I think
I'm not
Eklavya,
wearing a. I'm not wearing a vest. It's not a vest, guys. Don't
It's not a
misinterpret.
vest, it's a Sando Genji. That's a difference.
Sando Genji, bro.
It's a sleeveless. It's a sleeveless T-shirt.
Bro, that's what we call it in USA. That's capitalism.
Yes, right. This is a Sando Genji.
This is Sando Genji. This
Oh
is
my god.
CPI.
we
So
can
how
have
much?
another.
How much do you guys pay for a Sando Ganji?
$90.
Are you mad?
Bro, Lux Cozy is $90.
Again,
Where did
not
the
Lux
conversation go?
Not Lux
Dude,
Cozy.
we
Oh
recorded.
God, we went from
Sorry, Suri.
dictatorships
Sorry.
to dictatorships to
That was
vests and
a little
This
bit.
is a branded
t-shirts.
Sando Genji, not an unbranded one. Branded one.
So, enjoy. We vibe.
All right. That's it. We went from in a short span of 30 seconds, we went from dictatorships and
Sando
respected
Genji.
seniors to Sando Genjis. Right. Thank you for that. I think Ekalabya has to leave very soon, so I think we should now move on to the judges to declare the results. So I think we'll first start with which side they think has won the debate for this session at least, and for today, and then move on to the speakers awards.
you
So
didn't ask us to do the side thing. What?
oh, I mean,
Wow.
you can get.
Kohli, you see this?
So you can generally tell us which side you felt was better.
Generally, as in from what you heard, on a general idea.
Sorry? Why is he giving us that look?
Ryan,
I'm trying to tally the marks to see which side is better.
I mean, with the
Please
arguments that you heard, just a
get
general.
that background off.
Ryan,
Don't
alright,
tell it the marks, just what do you feel about it? Like which
yeah,
side?
even Ryan, what did you think?
I think that the proposition had a very tough job, but in the end, the opposition was better in my opinion. They could just defend how the parameters of a benevolent dictatorship won't work, how it would come about, and everything. I think the opposition did a better job here.
Right. Common Kohli, what do you think?
I completely agree with Ryan. Even though some of side propositions members made really good points, side opposition took away the argument, especially because they put forward the models and how it doesn't work and how it would work, which made a lot of sense at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a vote, I would say exactly the same thing.
Cheerio. Yeah.
Right. So I think we'll move on to the awards now. I think Komal Kohli would like to announce them, uh, or Ryan, or shall I do it?
Yeah, Suryansh, go ahead.
Right. So thank you for this privilege. So the results are as follows. In third place, we had Shinjoy Sen. Congratulations. And in second, we had a tie between Jay and Ishan, who also congratulations to the both of you. And finally, in first place, we had the very aggressively argumentative, the most argumentative speaker in my opinion, Pranit Sinha. Congratulations, well done. So right, and but Komagoli would also wanted to mention that by a very small margin, the other speakers lost out, like Ranak
Yeah, I
and
was waiting for that
Ranak.
signature move of yours.
Like,
How
no,
you
honestly, because Komagoli just
make them a goat.
message. Komagoli just sent this to me on the chat group. I swear to you.
That's fair enough, guys.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah. In the judges' eyes and in mine, I think they've all of you have done a brilliant job, and
What is the difference between first, second, and third, if I may ask? Suresh?
I believe it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can go ahead with that. Yeah. So Komal Koli marked out of 30 and I marked out of 40. So it was like Pranit got 56.5. Then Jay and Ishan came in at 52. Enjoy got 51.5 and Ranak got 51. So it was a 0.5 mark difference. It was pretty close. But
Ishan,
yeah, that's what
Ishan,
happened.
0.5 means something, no?
Bro,
Ishan knows very well. Ishan knows very well about the 0.5 thing.
Bro, don't do that. Bosco, I lost out by 0.5. Anyway.
Too many. Right. The spirit of competition here is quite lively and good-hearted.
Okay, I didn't get it. Pranit was at 66.
56.
Oh, 50. Oh, wow.
56 and 56.
Congrats,
Right.
man.
Yeah.
And Ryan,
56.5 actually. 56.
This is a combined score.
This is a combined score. Yeah.
Right. Thank you to the judges for joining us, and I hope all of you judges, the participants, we hope to have you back next time. Thank you, Ishan. Thank you, Discourse.
Yeah. All I'd like to say is that this was my first time, right? And so I had a lot of fun. Thank you to Pradeep for introducing me to this. My first time was a lot of fun.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining, Ranak. Thank you for conveying the message.
Yeah, make the Birla boys proud.
Man, Ronak kept asking me before the debate, dude, how's the atmosphere here? How's the atmosphere here?
Well, I hope.
And it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Good,
Well,
dude. You should have seen how intense it was like 2 weeks back.
Right.
Oh God. Bhalo time mein interview.
That was like.
Well, you could see all of that on our YouTube channel. That,
Baba, there is YouTube channel.
Yes.
Nice
You're
plug.
telling me whatever we have said is not protected.
Right.
No, it's not.
I will meet you people in Yemen. This is enough for me in this country.
Why do you think Suryansh is always so formal?
Oh God, no wonder this guy is the host. Host is neutral.
This is not real life Suryansh. This is not real life Suryansh.
আজকে ওকে কোনো radical view দিতে হচ্ছে না। আমরা এখানে মোদি টোদির নামে যা তা বলে যাচ্ছি ভাই।
Hey, recording is still going on by the way.
Whoa. I am not in Yemen. Okay, no, I am in Yemen.
Bro.
I am now in Yemen.
Yes.
Recording.
Suryansh.
Yes.
Please censor the CBI versus CBI part of my speech.
Oh man, editing.
Directly related to Amit Shah.
Omit, you have to omit at least 40% of the clips. Bro, we don't sedition tradition ho jaye serious hai.
Thank God I was going to say about Urjit Patel and Raghuvan Rajan. Thank God I didn't say.
Sorry, I'll leave, okay?
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, even I'm off. Thank you so much.
Probably the best ending to that. Thank you guys for joining in. And I think we'll see you in the next one. Yeah,
Thanks, man.
bye. Thank you guys for joining. Yeah, bye-bye.